which was introduced in the US Congress by progressive Democrats Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders. So thank you so much for joining us. Welcome, Daniel Troy.
Good evening. Thank you so much for coming. I got this book, Imperial Mode of Living, and I feel like I'm living it because I speak to you in English. And assume you will all understand, because actually I'm Canadian, but I live in the United States, so please forgive me for my linguistic limitations. I'm very excited to be here. I got permission to talk for 40-45 minutes, and then we have a conversation together. The theme is democracy or eco-apartheid, and I will put it in the context of the rise of green capitalism. I'm going to start by saying a bit about how I came to this topic. First, in the slides here, just a tiny bit about my biography. My father was Jewish, from a family that came to Canada 100 years ago. My mother is Guatemalan, and many of you will know that in Guatemala there was also a genocide in the 1980s. 200,000 people, mostly indigenous, were killed. So I had the opportunity to grow up talking about two different genocides, of course, in the Holocaust and in Guatemala. And I think an important lesson from that is that when well-informed people tell you that the apocalypse is coming, you should pay attention. You should pay attention. And that apocalypse doesn't necessarily come for everyone. It comes for some. I think for me, with that background, when I learned about the science of climate change, it was for me easy to accept because I knew that such a catastrophic development was very possible. As my friend Mary Hegler says, she is a Black American, climate change is not the first existential crisis for many people, and that helps us understand it better. Okay, my work. I'm a sociologist at the University of California, Berkeley. I study climate and inequality with a focus on the United States and Brazil. I run this lab. I've been studying climate and housing politics in São Paulo, Brazil, and New York since 2010. But even so, when I came to visit Vienna in 2018, and Armin and Sandra showed me around, it actually changed my life. I had what felt like a religious conversion experience to discover that a rich city in the middle of Europe could have this incredible tradition of social housing. I went on to write a book about the Green New Deal and to write several articles about the Green New Deal. And always the central theme was green social housing and green affordable housing for the multiracial working class and for people who are poor all over the world. And thanks to these articles and the way that I wrote about Vienna, you can see Karl Marx up here, I got invited to advise the national tenant movement in the United States on green social housing policy. I advised the Bernie Sanders campaign for president, and then I led the research for AOC's Green New Deal for public housing legislation. Now, I'm American, so of course you expect me to show pictures of myself, but this is the last one. I just want to assure you that I'm not some random person who just speaks English. And I have co-founded now a left-wing climate think tank called the Climate and Community Project. So I've been doing for many years trying to tell a happy story about how we could do great on climate change, have amazing policies, and everybody will be happy. And as you may have noticed, we didn't exactly succeed in winning the Green New Deal in the United States. So I'm now trying to step back and deepen my analysis, and with the communities like this one, deepen our analysis of the barriers and the obstacles and the problems. So this is a more kind of negative view on eco-apartheid, the problems it causes. And I'm in the middle of writing a book about it very quickly, so these thoughts might be chaotic. But as Armin says, if the presentation is chaotic, it's because the world is chaotic. So capitalism is imprinting itself in the speech. That's critical theory. You have to be inside this machine. So my goal today is to connect some dots to inform a more effective left common politics, if I can say that in this building. I want to connect the climate emergency to inequalities of class and race and ethnicity and national origin, etc. The rise of green capitalism, and then also we should think maybe a bit in the conversation about the rise of the extreme right and also the renewal of the left. And I'm going to try to bring in some history and radical political economy. So we're in a climate emergency. I've seen these posters also in Vienna, but climate change is not just a story about animals. It is also a story about people. But it is not a story, a simple story about people, because not everybody is equally vulnerable. Not everybody is equally responsible for the climate crisis. This is São Paulo There's a famous photograph. On the left is a favela called Paraisópolis, and on the right is a rich neighborhood called Morumbi. And on every single balcony, there's a swimming pool. This was a poorly designed tax break. They wouldn't build like this in Vienna, I think, unless it was for working class people. And already we see, as Klima mentioned, not just between countries, but within the global south, enormous disparity in how people experience the environment. And indeed, the global south is definitely more vulnerable to climate breakdown, and all the research shows that. But most countries do face risks. And within country inequality is very, very important. And it's not just within country unequal vulnerability to climate change, but unequal responsibility for climate change. Yes, the global north is mainly responsible. The United States alone, 1/4 of all carbon pollution in history. The European Union, 22% of all carbon pollution in history. But when we break it down in terms of individuals, the top 1% in the whole world is now responsible for almost 20% of carbon pollution. And that's mostly because of their investments and not their consumption. So let's have an analysis of capitalism and not just shopping. And what's interesting is that this has become more and more true in the last 30 years. With globalization, with the increasing wealth of many countries in the South, it used to be 30 years ago in 1990 that most inequality in carbon pollution could be explained based on which country you were born in. But today, most inequality in carbon emissions is based on class. And so that's this blue line is a measure of how much inequality can be attributed to class, and the red line is how much inequality can be attributed to your country. So we are seeing essentially a globalization of the 1% and its responsibility for carbon pollution. So I think this is trying to really make the case. This is a social issue, climate change. It is not a kind of, it's a universal issue, but not in a superficial way. Another thing that I think is important here, we are probably past the point of facing apocalyptic global warming. Most scientists now believe that the world will warm between 2 degrees Celsius and 3 degrees Celsius. Now, the less carbon, the less warming, the less death. It also means, I think, we can get a bit out of the dichotomy of are we all going to die, or are we all going to save the planet, and focus more on what will be the nature of climate impacts and what will be the way in which we decarbonize, and really see this as a social question. The next 80 years are about determining how the economy changes, how society changes in the face of climate change. And I don't think we can use the idea that everybody will die as an excuse to avoid these social questions, right? That can, the view that we have 12 years and then everybody will die, that can actually be a distraction from the question of inequality. Speaking of inequality, so Philip Alston, who is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, in 2019 raised this concept of climate apartheid, which I think is a very powerful concept, climate apartheid. And he defined it in a vague but very simple, straightforward way. He wrote, and I think this would be well received in Austria, an over-reliance on the private sector to address climate change could lead to climate apartheid, in which the wealthy pay to escape overheating, hunger, and conflict, while the rest of the world is left to suffer. Right, so climate apartheid is about the ability of the wealthy to insulate themselves from the impacts of climate change. Now, it's a powerful concept. I also think that if you read the news, you will understand it easily. These stories are tragically common. On the left, I showed a story, this was earlier this year, 18 migrants dying in an effort to get into Spanish territory in Morocco. We see, of course, as you know, Fortress Europe trying to build a higher and higher wall. The European Foreign Secretary said a few days ago that Europe is a garden and the rest of the world is a jungle and everyone else is trying to get in. Socialist, Josep Borrell. And at the same time, we have things like this plan for a $400 billion new city in the US desert. And that's a plan by a billionaire who's a former executive from Walmart. And we could go, there's a long list of new green cities for the rich that are being proposed, from Nigeria to Nevada. So I think we understand intuitively what climate apartheid is about, almost to the point that it has become an unfortunate cliche. This is a famous photograph as well, also in Morocco, actually. This is on Spanish territory, a golf course. And you see literally while they're playing golf, migrants trying to get over the fence. And this photo was taken in 2019. But I think we want to ground this basic understanding, this core intuition about climate inequality in a richer analysis of political economy and of history, in the racial analysis. So I'm going to argue that climate apartheid is really a subtype of eco-apartheid. And I use the phrase eco-apartheid to refer to a longer historical pattern before the climate crisis, a more holistic connection between ecology and environment, let's just say ecology and economy, sorry. I want to bring in a radical political economy perspective, and especially informed by the Black radical tradition. And I hope that this will help us better resist climate apartheid, this broader story, which I think will also connect to a broader story that has been developing in radical places for a long time. So to begin, the history of climate change simply is the history of colonialism and racial capitalism. I think that should be obvious. On the left, you see the history of economic growth, and on the right, you see the history of carbon pollution, and you will notice that they are identical. Not that subtle. How does this all get going? It gets going, the modern capitalist world system, I am convinced. It starts in England, but it really takes off with the colonization of the Americas and the beginning of really intense resource extraction and mining. Here is Potosi, one of the world's great silver mines. This was in it's now Bolivia. An enormous amount of wealth extracted, colonial masters and indigenous slave workers. Indeed, this created, some argue, the first global city. It's cosmopolitan colonial capitalism. Now, there's very powerful research, and this was published in Nature from a few years ago, that argues not only or rather that argues that the colonization of the Americas not only is it the sort of kickoff of global capitalism, but is actually the first human marker on the level of carbon pollution in the atmosphere. And so what you see here in the red is carbon concentration in the atmosphere. And you see that in 1610, it is very low. And this situation is very tragic but simple. So many indigenous peoples were killed in the Americas by violence and also by disease. And partly this is because the Europeans had domestic animals, but they did not have domestic animals in the Americas because of the coincidence of where different animal species were. So the Europeans brought diseases that came from their relationship to animals in the Americas, but there was no counterfire because the indigenous peoples in the Americas did not have animals that could be domesticated. So tens of millions of people died. This is a genocide. We don't know how many, maybe 40 up to 90 million people died. So many millions of indigenous people died in a short period that the entire continent reforested. And so many trees grew that it pulled carbon down from the atmosphere at this level that you can see here. This is a human-caused blip. There's no other explanation for that change in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is recorded in things like tree rings. And so there's a very strong argument that the conquest of the Americas in the 17th century, of course, is not putting carbon pollution, but it is the first human impact on the chemical composition of the atmosphere. And then the next human impact is when they start burning fossil fuels in the 18th century. And that is what kicks off modern climate change. So to me, the history of the climate emergency is a 500-year history of racial capitalism and of colonialism. And this also, I think, helps push us in this direction of understanding that economic history equals environmental history equals an eco-apartheid framework. So you can see we have very complicated American math here on the board. So what is an eco-apartheid framework? Let me try to specify this a bit more, and I think there is no better analyst of this than Nelson Mandela, who, as many of you will know, was a South African freedom fighter who played a huge role fighting the apartheid system in South Africa. He spent 27 years in prison and then was the first Black elected leader of South Africa. And Nelson Mandela actually provides a very good template for simply defining eco-apartheid in his account of gold mine in Johannesburg. So let me read you an excerpt here. So in Nelson Mandela's famous book, Long Road to Freedom, he describes when he was 22 years old, so about 1940, he traveled to Johannesburg, he sort of escaped his home, and he somehow got his way to a job for a few weeks at a gold mine. And he describes what this gold mine was like. So this is Johannesburg gold mining. And he explains that the Black miners were housed according to tribe. So different groups of Black miners were housed in specific areas for their tribe. And he writes, quote, "The mining companies preferred such segregation because it prevented different ethnic groups from uniting around a common grievance. This separation often resulted in factional fights between different ethnic groups and clans, which the companies did not discourage. They appreciated this because it helped create division among the different black workers. They did this on purpose. He said this was an emblem of South African capitalism. And then he said there is nothing magical about a gold mine with no greenery. He said the extractive landscape resembles, quote, a war-torn battlefield. Everywhere I looked, I saw black men in dusty overalls looking tired and bent. Only the presence of cheap labor in the form of thousands of Africans working long hours for little pay with no rights made gold mining profitable for the mining houses, white-owned companies that became wealthy beyond the dreams of Croesus on the backs of African people. And you see here almost, I think, all the elements of eco-apartheid. It's not just separate housing, although it's that, it's also an institution of the labor market. It is the division of people into different categories to make it easier for them to be exploited. And it is a fundamentally economic system, right? It's not that white people came to South Africa in order to be better racists. They came to extract resources and they used racism to their advantage. Now this system is in fact, if you look around the world, the default system of resource extraction. And we can even say beyond resource extraction. So in Guatemala, the country where my mother was born and grew up, you look at the United Fruit Company, it was the richest company in Latin America for years, banana plantation. They imported black workers from the Caribbean to work alongside Guatemalan workers and to create ethnic and racial rivalries between them to make it easier to control that labor force, ultimately requiring multiracial resistance. If you look at the whole history of the oil industry, you see this. In Saudi Arabia, Aramco, they literally modeled the labor control system on Jim Crow rules in the United States of racism. In Iran, they likewise combined Iranian workers, migrant workers from other parts of the Middle East, of course, white technical engineers, and used multiple minor divisions to perpetuate and to justify inequality in the labor force. Of course, this is not just a matter of colonialism between countries, but colonialism within countries. You see this exact model in the United States. Here is a picture of some black and white miners in West Virginia, which is an American coal extraction state. And the research there finds, again, almost the exact same pattern. So one historian wrote that companies recruited black workers from out of state because they considered a quote-unquote judicious mixture of white workers, black workers, and immigrant workers as an effort to forestall unionization by segregating the men and playing one group off against another. In the words of one coal operator in 1933, he said, "We get the best results when one class of miners is looked down upon by the others to try to get advantage of the other class in the way of good places and responsible positions which pay more money." So we know that in capitalism, there is a complicated division of labor. And the idea here, I think, is pretty straightforward. To maintain the unbelievable inequality of a system of owners and workers, it is very useful if you can use racial, ethnic, regional, gender, caste, any kind of difference you can find to justify hierarchies within a group of workers and put them against each other. And you see this all over the economy, not just in resource extraction, although I think it's very obvious there, but you see versions of this in manufacturing, in agriculture, in infrastructure construction, in care work, in medical development, which bodies get used for experiments. Often black bodies get used for medical experiments. And of course, we use this to create sacrifice zones. So I could go on at length, but I think the basic point I want to make here initially is looking, what is this history of the combination of racism and other forms of discrimination and capitalism? It really comes down to a strategy for maintaining inequality and extracting profit, right? Those stories cannot be connected. Now, it may be the case that in Central Europe, where you are all the experts, not me, the stories are different, but I'm pretty confident that throughout the Americas and in much of the world, and in much of the history of colonialism, you have this pattern that I am describing. Okay, I'm gonna jump ahead here. W.E.B. Du Bois was a great black sociologist in the United States who ultimately became a communist. In the 1930s, described exactly this when he tried to explain how was it that after the American Civil War, after the liberation of slaves, he said some people thought that black workers and white workers would combine and simply overthrow capitalism. Why not? He said the theory of race was supplemented by a carefully planned and slowly evolved method which drove such a wedge between the white and black workers that there probably are not today in the world two groups of workers with practically identical interests who hate each other, who hate and fear each other so deeply and persistently, or kept so far apart, apartheid, that neither sees anything of common interest. So for Du Bois, it is very clear that weaponism is an instrument of, racism is an instrument of class war. That doesn't mean he thinks it's superficial or just a joke, but he is linking very closely the problems of racism and economy. Barbara Fields, who's a great Black historian of this period as well, has often criticized liberal historians, where she says that the majority of American historians may think of slavery in the United States as mainly a system of race relations, as though the chief business of slavery were the production of white supremacy rather than the production of cotton, sugar, rice, and tobacco. Race is not an idea, but an ideology. It came into existence at a discernible historical moment for rationally understandable historical reasons. And she shows in her historical analysis how pure Black slavery as developed in the United States came late in the game. It was a strategy to essentially avoid Black and Irish immigrant workers, Black workers were enslaved, Irish workers in detention, from combining and fighting together as was starting to happen. They realized they needed to use a system of racism to have a firmer division within labor at that time. Again, none of this is to understate racism, but to contextualize where does it come from in the modern form. Ruth Wilson Gilmore, this is a very complicated quote, but essentially what she talks about is the fact that the form of racism, or ethnic discrimination, or caste discrimination is always changing. She calls it a changing saying, saying the way in which racial ideology develops is always shifting, but it always is essentially doing the same thing, reproducing economic inequalities, which then validate theories of extra economic hierarchical difference. So there's a kind of feedback loop between racial discrimination and economic inequality. These things are feeding off of each other. And I think if we're going to be precise in a global context, right, we recognize that in the United States we talk a lot about race, and there's a specific history for that, but I think this kind of theory works well if we're talking about ethnic discrimination, gender discrimination, caste discrimination. In India, and we see today the discrimination against Dalits, untouchables, very, very strong, but we shouldn't call that racial politics. That would be exporting American ways of talking. National origin, even region, let's say in China, if you're from a rural area, in a city you can be exploited in a specific way, you have different rights. So you just have this various, you could really say it's difference capitalism, I think would be more precise than just racial capitalism, and we see this with gender as well, of course, very classic. And feminists have long pointed out the similarity. You know, Black people are said, oh, they're closer to nature, they're barbarians, or they get called monkeys. And then women, oh, they're closer to nature, like they bleed. You know, the man of the brain and the woman of the body, right? So we have actually quite analogous ways of discriminating and symbolic violence against people of color and against women. And these intersect and compound. And of course, women of color suffer this the most, as we know. And this is all, you will always find this in the economic relationship to nature, and I think the symbolic association of non-white men to nature. And so we see almost universal resistance to this. I think that's very important. This is always being resisted. For Mandela, it was essential that the African National Congress Liberation Movement was a multiracial movement. And he actually saw a competitor movement called the Pan-African Congress. He said they only wanted to be a movement only for Black people, and actually the American State Department liked them better, because they thought they would be less effective and more easily co-opted. We see here on the left in Guatemala, massive resistance, multiracial movement, creating economic democracy for 10 years. We see in the United States, in West Virginia, the only reason the mine workers were able to unionize and contribute to the American New Deal was because of the constant commitment to multiracial unionizing. And we see that this resistance is often crushed by violence, economic or political. There's a book about the coup in Iran to repress the revolt against colonial oil ownership. Coup in Guatemala to prevent indigenous peasants and urban workers from creating an economic democracy together. In fact, my mother's uncle was the Minister of Infrastructure in the government that got deposed by a coup. My grandfather put him in the trunk of his car and drove him to the embassy of El Salvador. It's the only way that my uncle escaped alive. Then he lived in, basically he just stayed at home and his wife worked in a beauty parlor. And that's how he kept him alive. So they didn't change everything in that household. And indeed in South Africa as well, we have a victory against legal apartheid, but you have multiple South African scholars saying now that economic apartheid continues. It has simply been privatized. Okay, so finally, the definition. What is eco-apartheid? How am I defining it? I hope it feels intuitive here. I'm defining it as the divide and conquer strategy of capitalism, whose elites have typically weaponized a range of differences to maintain the system's inherently high levels of class inequality. State and paramilitary violence play key roles. This is not an Economics 101 textbook, but the story of violence, I think, is essential, and that's why the analogy to apartheid is so important. It's not just very unequal, it is inequality maintained with state violence or paramilitary violence. And environmental costs and benefits are constantly distributed along these lines of race, class, gender, and so on. I'm also arguing that capitalism has always been a way of organizing nature. Nature, resources are not a kind of secondary issue. That is what capitalism is. It is the production of non-human nature and the production of human nature, like the reproduction of workers, or people literally being born. Capitalism is fundamentally a way of organizing nature, it's the words of Jason Moore, and we see this in extraction, manufacturing, infrastructure, agriculture, social care, etc. And I think the more viscerally people are in contact with nature, the more you see these dynamics of racial and ethnic and gender difference. And I think the care sector is a good example of this as well, who takes care to keep people living, that is biological life, human nature, that is largely women, and they are punished for it every day. Hopefully feminism helps to fight against that, but I think we should recognize how things go. And we see this dynamic everywhere, and it's also the question of abandonment. Who gets exposed to toxic harms? What communities find the most pollution, the most economic insecurity, the most austerity? And of course, these are communities of color. But finally, it's important to emphasize that we don't just live this horrible new story, but we live in the balance between eco-apartheid and democratic counter movements. Right here we are in the welfare state, far from perfect, not at all absent of racism, but there is a difference across the world, and where you have successful democratic mobilization, you can contain and limit apartheid. Of course, in Europe, you also just move it to the colonies. In the United States, we move it to the south. So I don't think we have any really complete answers, but certainly this is a bit Polanyian for those who read Karl Polanyi, but I think we live a bit in balance. People are always resisting this eco-apartheid. So the point is not that we are all every day in the worst version of this, although many are. I'm not going to get into this now, but a lot of this actually builds on feminist political economy as well. Okay. I've been talking a lot, right? It's a bit fast? No? Okay. All right. It's hard to know. Okay, so what's new? If I'm saying this is a story of continuity, there must be some change, right? I did acknowledge there is a climate crisis. So what is changing? A lot is changing, actually, but I'm going to maintain my theme of political economy. So we live in a time of climate breakdown, and this is distinctive because it does threaten to annihilate the conditions of life on Earth. We also live in a time of technological progress, and it's a new phase of capitalism. Now, those of you might remember that 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, from every level of government, the debate about climate change was who will bear the burden of decarbonizing. That's what Kyoto was about in 1997. Which countries will take on the burden of cutting carbon emissions by 5%. But today, this is really seen as an opportunity. Who will lead green growth? Who will be in charge of the most competitive sectors? There has been real technological progress. The fact that solar energy is quite cheap, we make it cheap, has been important. So there is something really distinctive about this moment. We're not in 2015 anymore. We're not in 2010. But the climate breakdown has been happening. The climate science has not changed in 40 years, but the way people think about green capital has. The other thing is that the global economic elite, I would argue every major institution of global capitalism that's relevant outside the North American right, and I guess outside of Russia, is calling for a green turn in capitalism. The Chinese Communist Party, of course, is the most effective climate green capitalist organization in the world. But you took the Democratic Party, Davos, World Economic Forum, The Economist, Financial Times, McKinsey, any prestigious institution of global capitalism outside the American right, and I suppose Putin, but it's not prestigious, is identifying this. This is a list of the top 10 risks identified by business leaders by the World Economic Forum in Davos. Okay, let's read them in order. 1, climate action failure. 2, extreme weather. 3, biodiversity loss. 4, social cohesion erosion. They're a bit worried about fascism. 5, livelihood crises. 6, infectious diseases. COVID. 7, human environmental damage. 8, natural resource crises. Okay, then we have debt, and we have geoeconomic confrontation. You look at the top 8, that is practically the agenda of Bernie Sanders. I mean, it's quite remarkable. And in fact, you look at people like Martin Wolf, the chief economic correspondent of the Financial Times, which is the newspaper of the 1%. He is terrified of fascism. He would rather just have liberal capitalism, almost the same. And he's terrified of the climate emergency. And at the same time, what makes that terror a little easier is now the conviction in Capital, this is Forbes magazine, that this is a huge economic opportunity. McKinsey, which you all know about McKinsey probably, a global consultancy, they believe that tackling climate change will require $100 to $300 trillion in investments in the built environment, infrastructure, housing, energy, over the next 30 years. And others say 100 trillion. But even though it's just a PDF, you start to see this with things like Belt and Road, with the new spending of the Biden administration, with what's happening with the European Union. I think we can essentially take for granted, maybe not this number, but there will be a massive new investment in the built environment. And a lot of that will be linked to climate change. Some for adaptation, although I think less than you would want. And that, I think, is what we're actually going to be fighting over. How will the built environment be changed? And as you all know, who study political economy, infrastructure investment always requires the state. Nobody wants to take a 30-year risk without the state support. We know this in Austria. I was just at Aspirin Lake City. They said, we decided to wait for the state to put in 400 million for the subway, then we can build. You can't do built-in, it's not like making a pen, where you just put up a factory, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. The expense and the risk of built environment transformation has always required state support. So as in colonialism, we saw this after World War II. We see this to some degree in Europe. We see in the United States now, the return of infrastructure only happens when the federal government spends money. So it puts the state back on the agenda in a huge way. I think that may feel somewhat subtle here, but in North America and in the United States, it's huge. And we also see the most powerful capitalist economy in the world, China, as a state-led actor. Hillary Clinton said recently that we can never compete with Chinese capitalism because of its state support, unless in the United States we also focus on the means of production. So the entire American elite now is trying to have more state intervention to support their industry, deglobalize, and to have a much more bigger state role. Okay, so that's the context. What are the 3 lessons for climate apartheid that I think eco-apartheid gives us? What is the point of this entire analysis? And I'm going to expand on these in a tiny bit of detail. So I think one is we should think about the inequalities of climate apartheid, as much as possible connect them to the changes, the developments of green capitalist public-private partnerships. Now, there's a huge number of inequalities. We could talk all night about immigration and climate change, and we could talk about it in discussion. It's a very big topic. We could talk about things like climate apartheid in Palestine, about some expertise, but I think it's important to include and to focus quite a bit on how inequality is changing with the rise of green capitalism. So it's not just spontaneous discrimination that's causing climate apartheid, nor is it just timeless, from time immemorial hatred among people, but there's a specific form of capitalist inequality, green capitalist inequality. Second, therefore you cannot fight climate change without fighting inequalities. It is simply not possible. It is simply, and I'll give you some examples when it comes down to would feel like almost minor political issues, how inequalities are always there. And finally, the contradictions of green capitalism, just like the contradictions of agrarian or industrial capitalism, create constant opportunities for creating alternatives. So the contradictions of green capitalism create openings for what I would call really green multiracial economic democracy. What exactly that looks like, only we can decide. But green capitalism is not a monolith. It is not a behemoth. It's full of contradictions, like the reliance on the state. And we can talk more about that as well, because I have my list of contradictions, but another part of my computer. But those contradictions do create openings for us. And I'm going to try to give you some examples in a bit Viennese style, not from Vienna, of successes already, small but meaningful successes. Okay, so I'm not going to talk forever, so let's jump in here. Green capitalism. Okay, so inequalities in the heart of green capitalist public-private partnerships. How they deepen violent inequality, how they further abandon low-value communities, but also create targets for revolt. Okay, show me the money. What the hell are we even talking about? Where is green capitalism going? This is an analysis of climate finance. It's been called climate finance, public and private. What you see already right now is the overwhelming biggest categories of green capital. They're going into transportation, which is mostly electric vehicles, except actually in India, where they're creating a lot of electric rickshaws, and energy systems, which is mostly renewable energy. And I call this plug-and-play green infrastructure. So it's not that this capital is going into creating a beautiful, democratic, egalitarian green infrastructure. It's creating wind turbines, solar panels, and electric vehicles that they want to plug in to the existing system. That's what's easy for private capital to do, right? They just want to build machines to plug in. So they're not transforming things in an egalitarian and efficient way. They're simply creating new machines. By the way, if you add up road transportation and energy, that is only 1/3 of carbon pollution worldwide. So this is not what you would call a rational allocation of capital. And I think that will shock everybody at the Volkshochschulen that capital is not being rationally allocated by the private market. Who is funding adaptation? Who's going to protect us from climate change? Well, it's only the public sector, actually. Because private capital has zero interest in defending people like us from climate impacts. But by the way, there are some reasons to think the public sector is not so obsessed with equality either. And I'll give some examples. So basically, snapshot, what is the first takeaway from green capital? One, it's largely funding the easiest things to do, which is simply things to plug in, wind, solar, electric vehicles. Second, in terms of actually protecting us from extreme weather, only the public sector is involved. And again, there are reasons to be concerned. We are seeing already the same patterns of racial inequality in the heart of green production. Take Tesla, systematic discrimination against Black workers in the United States. What about Tesla in its relationship to North America immigration system? It's amazing. There's now a major town in Mexico that has a big Tesla factory, and then across the border in the United States, there's another Tesla factory. So they created a dedicated lane only for Tesla industrial traffic. So if you're Mexican, as you know, it's very hard to cross the border. But if you are with a truck full of Tesla machines, now Mexico is giving you a specific traffic lane just for you to have complete economic integration of Tesla industrial ecology on both sides of the border. That's quite striking. Most people moving from Mexico to the United States do not get that privilege. Now, it's not just that if you're driving in a Tesla, you get to cross the border, it's if you're carrying Tesla machines, right? So this is the special economic zone, now trans-border for Tesla. I have not been able to find systematic data on this, but I'm working on it with a research assistant. But actually, when you go through the US labor market, I'll mainly talk about the US here, but not only, just some examples, you actually find that the higher paid the job is in the green economy, the more likely the worker is to be white. Wind technicians, you work in wind, the average annual salary is $56,000, 71% white. What if you're installing solar panels? Well, then the annual wage is only $46,000. That's 20% less. And now the percent of the white labor force has already come from 70 down to 55%. So you already see all the way through the green value chain, racial difference in the labor market composition. You see this, of course, around the world. It turns out that an enormous amount of the manufacturing work that goes into solar panels is being done in Western China with indentured Uyghur workers, right? So this is a handy excuse. Ethnic violence, state violence at the same time, and by the way, those factories are powered with coal, right? So we see the complete colonial model being used to produce quote-unquote solar panels. We also see now the United States is trying to prevent them, but of course the United States can't make enough solar panels on their own, so a bunch of green capitalists in the United States want to suspend and allow this importation from China for a few more years while they create their own factories with government handouts. New sacrifice zones for green extraction. This will be an enormous fight. It will be just like the last centuries of colonization. This is a photo of lithium mining in Latin America. This is in Chile. And in Chile, Argentina, and elsewhere, you see enormous indigenous protests against this lithium extraction, which is devastating their communities. In Latin America, lithium mining is basically mining water. They basically evaporate water, leave salt, and pull out lithium, and these are in some of the driest ecosystems in the world. So it's devastating for indigenous peoples who are always bearing the brunt of economic development, right? Oh, don't we need Teslas? Well, who will pay the price? Oh, perfect, indigenous people, no problem. But it's not just the story of the global south, and this is an interesting thing. We are actually, with onshoring, we are actually now onshoring resource extraction. In the United States, the prevailing mining law was written in 1871. That was peak American settler colonialism. That's when they were taking all the indigenous land away from people. And those are the laws that are governing the extraction of critical minerals in the United States, which are mostly on indigenous land. So now we have in Nevada, indigenous peoples fighting against a new lithium mine that's being set up. And as you'll know, the Biden administration is putting huge incentives now to develop lithium in the United States and other critical minerals, and a huge amount of that will be on indigenous land. We're guaranteed to start a massive conflict. What will that conflict look like? Will it be violent? Well, I don't know. Let's look at natural gas infrastructure. We have seen most recently that in Minnesota, they were building a pipeline for natural gas, or methane gas, called Line 3. The Canadian pipeline company, Enbridge, made donations to all the police departments in northern Minnesota state, and in exchange, those police departments hired officers to arrest the protesters who were indigenous and their white allies. This is to make the old British East India Company proud, this level of innovation, business model integration, you might call it. The Canadian company and the American state. Of course, the people in the United States say have foreign companies paying our police. Well, I think an American company would do the same. It just happens to be Canadian in this case. Indeed, we have seen that around the world, environmental activists are constantly being killed. And those are not actually white Greenpeace activists for the most part, but it is essentially indigenous peoples defending their land from extraction. Now, a lot of that is mining. And I don't think you will see a difference when the nickel is being used for the fossil economy to when it's being used for the green economy. In fact, one of the scholars who does this research on the murder of environmental activists has said there are no companies in the green capitalist economy who have any kind of measures in place to prevent environmental land defenders from being murdered. So I think you will see, in that case, a very clear continuity. And indeed, when you think of one of the most famous environmental activists killed recently, it was Berta Cáceres, who was an indigenous woman in Honduras. She was killed because she was protesting a hydro dam that was being built as green energy. And actually, one of her main complaints was she said, they promised, well, the hydro dam will pay for medical services in the village. She said, no, the state should pay for medical services. The dam pays for medical services is the old colonial model. It's like, what are we all going to be in the United States for the rest of our lives? Come on, right? And so it's that resistance against that green colonial model where your only hope of modernization, quote unquote, is from an extractive industry. You resist that and you could die. I think we also have to talk about sacrifice zones. How do people become vulnerable to climate change? And again, it's a story of capitalism. So we have a study of Michigan, which is a state in the US where you have the auto industry. And what the study found is that in the last 20 years, or 15 years, the cities that were financially abandoned and then put under control of the state government were almost all cities with 40 to 90% of the population that was Black. So if you're a small white city in Michigan with a budget problem, we help you out. If you are a predominantly Black city, the state takes over your infrastructure and takes over your finances. What does that produce? That produces things like the lead poisoning in Flint, Michigan. This produces, and it's not only in Michigan, but in multiple American cities, the abandonment of infrastructure in the name of austerity. And who bears the brunt when the government has a shortage of $10 billion? It's Black communities. It's Black communities. And that is what is producing environmental vulnerability. Indeed, the only public service that they are creating for those communities is prisons. And you see on the right, the rise of mass incarceration tracks exactly with the decline of public investment in public goods. It's simply a cheaper way to house people of color in the United States. Let's look at public housing in New York City. This is a good example from Vienna. In the United States, they have cut funding for public housing maintenance. They don't build it anymore. Maintenance in half in the last 20 years. And so when Hurricane Sandy hit New York City, who was most vulnerable in many cases? The residents of public housing. Here's a picture of someone who was, he had carbon monoxide poisoning because he had to use his oven to heat his apartment after Hurricane Sandy. Had terrible, terrible problems in public housing after Hurricane Sandy in 2012. And what caused these problems? So here's a study. What is the rate of mold infestation in these apartments? So if you look on the right, 45%. After Hurricane Sandy, public housing buildings near the water, 45% had visible mold. 45% had visible mold. Now I'm told, and from what I can tell in Vienna, that would be closer to zero probably. But how many had visible mold before the storm? 34%. 34%. So climate change is turbocharging the inequalities that already existed. Now, as you saw, we did a Green New Deal for public housing, and actually, in Build Back Better, Biden's original proposal, there was $65 billion for public housing, but it was cut in the most recent version of the Inflation Reduction Act. It was actually the top priority for the most important Democrat in the Senate. So we came close. Okay, so you cannot fight climate change without fighting inequalities. You cannot fight carbon pollution, you cannot have a reasonable green economy, and you certainly cannot have justice and the impacts without fighting inequalities. But I want to make the case that this is not just moral, but it's practical. So let's take some very, very simple bread and butter issue here, solar panels. It turns out in the United States, most likely, if you have a solar panel on the roof of your house, you're white. Why is that? Because to put a solar panel on your roof, you need credit. Well, guess who has credit in the United States? It's white people. This goes all the way back to the New Deal, where black workers were excluded from the New Deal, essentially, as a condition for having social democracy imposed by white supremacists, Democrats in the United States. It's just the history of racial capitalism that never ends. So you have stark racial inequality, even when you control for income, stark racial inequality in who gets access to this most basic, simple service, a solar panel on your roof to save some money. Not only that, but now they find that the policy for putting a solar panel on the roof is that if you put a solar panel on your roof, you save money on your electricity bill. Okay, that's interesting. So if you have a solar panel on your roof and it's sunny in California, then your utility bill goes to zero. But utility bill doesn't just pay for the electricity, it pays for the wires. So what is happening now is that low-income renters of color are disproportionately now paying for the utilities because we give white people this benefit to put solar power on the roof. But the only way you can benefit is if you're a homeowner and probably if you're white. So they're shifting the cost of a crumbling utility, which is now being covered in fires, onto low-income tenants of color. Meanwhile, they have a tax system that makes it very easy for a white homeowner to put a solar panel on their roof. And what this now means is that they're trying to extend the subsidy for solar panels on roofs to white people, and the fossil fuel utilities are mobilizing low-income people of color to oppose this. And now the entire environmental movement is split between the ones who say we have to prioritize solar panels and the ones who have to prioritize environmental justice. But it is destroying the coalition because you essentially are producing environmental benefits overwhelmingly for white affluent households. And in the United States, if you pit them materially against people of color, that will erode the ability to have a coalition. And now let me talk a little bit more about why this is so devastating. We have all heard about this idea in the United States and probably hear that environmentalism is a white issue, a bourgeois issue. We don't have social democracy, but we have problems. I'm sure there are problems here too, but I'll let you describe them. Whiteness is famously the environmental problem. All of our founders of environmental movements in the United States were into eugenics, or racists, colonialists. And now environmental movements, for the most part, are led by white people. So it's a problem, or it's a question. How do we convince these people of color with less education to support environment when it's mainly a white-led movement? Well, here's the interesting thing. Actually, who cares most about climate change in the United States is Latinos, followed by black people, followed by white people. So these are the three. The bars are a bit hard to read, but I can assure you I am not making this up. Here's a better chart. Who is willing to take some kind of action to support climate policy? Latinos, blacks, and then far behind, white people. The constituency, political constituency for environmental action in the United States is people of color. They get it. What's fundamentally going on is, guess what? White men do not believe in climate change. They are very conservative people. They do not believe in climate change. Cool dudes is the way one sociologist put it. So actually, if you were trying to create a coalition where you're giving economic benefits to white people and putting economic costs on people of color for decarbonization, that is not a durable coalition. You're splitting your coalition, destroying it. Now you say, well, but stupid Americans, if only they went to school, then they would know more. Really? Let's look at what happens with education. Republicans, the most educated Republicans, are the least likely to believe in the science of climate change. And there's actually pretty good psychology on this. The more educated you are, the more resources you have to support ideology. That is the finding. The more educated you are, the better you are going on the internet and finding these stupid blogs that lie to you. There's also evidence in the United States that the political leadership of political parties has a major influence on public opinion. So what you see here on the bottom is this red line. As Democrats and independents believe more and more in the science of climate change, with the top passage of time and science, etc., Republicans stop. Actually, after John McCain's presidential campaign, the Koch and oil fossil fuel-funded Republicans took over the party. So John McCain actually supported a pretty aggressive climate plan. Then the party was taken over by the fossil fuel industry. The leader said climate change is a hoax, and Republicans started less and less believing in climate change. What the fossil fuel industry did was they actually turned climate change into an issue like abortion, identity issue. If you're a Republican, therefore you are anti-abortion, anti-climate action. So then what happens with disasters? Well, surely disasters are going to change things up. Well, not really. For one thing, if you don't have insurance, like most people in Florida, and you get destroyed by a hurricane, you're going to have horrible inequality. So then what do the Republicans do? They say, now we do need to put money into climate funding, but only for adaptation. Don't touch carbon pollution. Only for adaptation. Later they will say a bit of green capital, but they're always protecting the fossil fuel industry. So you'll perpetuate this inequality, including the United States not taking responsibility for climate action. This is the vanguard of the Republican Party now. Climate action equals adaptation. And what do the right-wing Democrats say? Climate action equals subsidies for the fossil fuel industry. This is the big thing that happened with the Joe Biden's climate bill this summer, is that there will be what we call all of the above plan. Money for green capitalism, and money for the fossil fuel industry. We use carbon capture and storage. So essentially what you're gonna just have is both. The green capitalism is not a killer of fossil capitalism, it is a complement. We simply will just adjust the bars. So the green capitalist path of least resistance, if we do not fight inequalities at every level, I think this is what we get. Yes, you will get public-private partnerships. You will get an infusion of green capital. You will fund solar and wind. You will fund electric vehicles. You will fund green extraction with all the racism and all the state violence we can expect. And you won't displace all the fossil fuels. You will simply increase the share of green energy. And that means that you will have decarbonization for sure, but you will not have full decarbonization. You will have public funding for adaptation, but as you've seen, certainly in the United States, certainly in places like Brazil, the tendency will be that adaptation will just protect the people who are already protected by the state. We're disproportionately white or upper class. We didn't talk about this today, but we can talk about immigration and how it's mostly now for guest worker visas, whether it's nurses or farmers or farm laborers. Moderate decarbonization because of the fractured political coalition. So it's not decarb yes or no, but it's moderate decarbonization. And of course, this creates serious openings for the far right and for eco-fascists, but it also creates openings for the multiracial green left. So now we come to the good news at the end of the presentation. How do these contradictions of green capitalism create opportunities for creating alternatives? And what would it look like to do multiracial, green political organizing, economic democracy edge? Let me remind myself of all those insane things I've said. Okay, I'm gonna move a bit quickly here, and I just want to tell 3 happy stories. So like I said, the 1920s, I should say 2020s. These will be years of the mixed economy, right? The mixed economy will create openings for the right, for the center, and for the left. The return of the state does generate a kind of post-neoliberal future. Which way will that go remains to be seen. We're certainly seeing a growing sophistication and power of anti-racist social movements. Can they come in time to stop fascism? We'll find out, but I think we should be optimistic. The world of Black Lives Matter inspires people in Austria. It's not because Americans are charismatic, it's because there's problems here too, and people here are ready to confront them. We do actually, the historic projects of the left do merge pretty well with climate action. So that alignment for us is objectively quite possible, right? Clean energy, union jobs, union green jobs, sustainable agriculture, well-paid care work, lower work hours, expanding public transit, residential density that's affordable. These are all consistent with the projects of the left. Many of them are the current projects of your parties. It is far easier to decarbonize and withstand disasters with solidarity, right? That's simply true. We actually have evidence of reducing inequality, and we have evidence of reducing work hours, both reduce carbon emissions. So we don't have a huge jujitsu to do to turn our left into a climate left. Can we build these coalitions? Okay, let me skip the surface. Yes. Let me give you 3 quick examples. This is Rachel Rivera. She's a working class New Yorker. She has an amazing story. She was literally born on the plane between Puerto Rico and New York City with a twin. So that would have been a crazy flight. It's like only 1 hour. During Hurricane Sandy, she actually didn't live anywhere near the water, but she lived in a cheap apartment, and the water crashed the roof, and it almost killed her daughter. She heard a crack, she grabbed her daughter out of bed, and a second later the water crashed into the bed. So it's a very long and interesting story, but Rachel became kind of a climate activist in the housing movement. And this was in the sort of 2016, 2015, 2012, 2013, 2014. And at the same time, the Working Families Party, the Progressive Party in New York City, realized that all the ways that you would get rid of inefficient energy were just jobs. So suddenly you had a housing movement in New York City with people of color who saw the impact of climate change. And then you had the Working Families Party, progressive politicians who were like, wait a minute, jobs. They got together with the environmental justice movements, with progressive politicians, other environmentalists, and they said, you know what, why don't we create a bill to take the carbon pollution out of buildings and strengthen rent stabilization? And what they did is in 2019, New York City Council passed a bill, they called it a Green New Deal for New York, that in 2009, Michael Bloomberg, billionaire mayor, most powerful mayor in New York City, could not even get a vote on the floor of the city council. 10 years later, same bill, but this time with rental protections, passed 45-2. complete transformation of climate policy in New York City. And by New York City in 2019, the mayor was an idiot, he sucked. But he was center-left. You added housing movements to the environmental group, you added progressive politicians, and then you were able to defeat the real estate industry in New York City. For a very rare to defeat the real estate industry, but you brought that fighting energy to housing movements, people like Rachel. And on the floor of City Council, when the vote passed, the City Councilor who put the vote up, he said, we have to pass this bill so that when mothers go to sleep at night, they don't worry that their family will be displaced by rising seas or by rising rents. By rising seas or by rising rents. So you had a fusion, that fusion of the economic justice issue with, and in New York that is a racial justice issue, the tenant movement is the movement of people of color, women of color, a fusion of that with climate. And it was only in that fusion that New York City could pass the country's most ambitious low-carbon urban bill. Let's go to Sao Paulo. This woman, Ivanete Araújo, she cut sugarcane for the ethanol industry in her early 20s. She was born in rural Sao Paulo. Black woman moved to Sao Paulo like many rural people. She got a job as a domestic worker, and you can imagine the conditions. Her apartment was so moldy, she asked for a raise so she could live somewhere else, and she was told to move onto the streets. So she was homeless for months until she found a housing movement in Sao Paulo. Then she was in the housing movement, squatting this building. It became the center of the Sao Paulo left. But then they became threatened by climate change, not from extreme weather, but green redevelopment, luxury green redevelopment. So the environmentalists said, we're going to do a green redevelopment of the city. We're going to have a city of short distances, neoliberal style. And it was fought by the housing movement. And the housing movement, with its allies in the working families, with the Workers' Party, PT, they got together and they blocked that redevelopment plan. And indeed, when their mayor got elected in 2013, the first thing he did was to cancel that plan. Then there was a student protest against bus prices. They built 400 kilometers of bus lanes in 1 year. 400 kilometers of bus lanes in 1 year. And then they did a master plan, Vienna style, zoned for public housing all along the corridors of densification. And every time the real estate built towers in these new corridors of density, they would have to pay into a fund to build public housing. This was a very good idea, but the city councilors in the center didn't want to pass it. So here's the mayor actually saying to the housing movement, you have to go pass this bill. Here's the environmental protests in Sao Paulo. Housing movement burnt tires in front of city council. They didn't care about the environmental protest, they just wanted the housing. But that night, city council voted to pass this bill. So the violence goes both ways. Haddad, then he said, that's not what I meant, I just thought they were going to be polite, give it for sure. And even though Haddad lost the election, actually it happened. And the money from the redevelopment turned the building that she was squatting, bought the building for the public sector so it could be made into public housing. They had the nursery at the bottom floor. And it's not just women, although we have to acknowledge it's mostly women leading these movements, but my friend Nikhil Sawal, he's a state legislator in Pennsylvania, he just passed a $125 million bill to repair homes, a whole homes repair bill in Pennsylvania, the most visionary home repair bill in the country. And how did he do it? A multiracial coalition. What we did, and our research showed, is that, and this is impossible to read, so I'll just tell you the conclusion, that in the urban core and in rural areas, you have identical level of suffering from high energy bills. Identical. And so Nikhil convinced Republicans in rural Pennsylvania, who are the majority of the state Senate, that this was a bill to help ordinary people with energy costs. And even though most of them were going to get green energy, there was a kind of economic benefit, and it would reduce light. So it would make homes sort of more high quality in rural areas. And with that urban-rural coalition, in a red state, he passed a big bill for home repairs. So I think that where I want to kind of move us toward ending here is a kind of Viennese lesson in a way. And the lesson is housing, and more broadly, it's the built environment. For me, the biggest and most interesting openings for green, multiracial economic democracy is policies you can literally touch, right? It's not just abstractions, it's not carbon in the atmosphere. It's like, if you cannot touch social justice, if you cannot put your hand on social justice, it does not exist. And if there's one thing I learned in Vienna, is that you can actually tell that there is socialism because you can actually touch it. You can actually touch it. I can guarantee you in the United States, you cannot touch liberalism. Liberalism will touch you, but it's the policeman. Even in the most capitalist, racist segment of society, which is the housing market, it is possible to organize a counteroffensive. Half of global wealth is held in housing. I mean, if you can do it in housing, it means you can do it somewhere else. And these movements that I've showed you are all multiracial movements led by people of color with clear environmental benefits. So it is hard to be optimistic. Oh, look, I didn't even finish the sentence here. But I think it's even harder to be optimistic if you don't see multiracial economic justice organizing as the core of the climate movement. If you put that at the core of the climate movement, then I think you have a chance. And if you go and look for good news stories, that is mostly what you're going to find. So I showed this picture before of eco-apartheid. This is São Paulo. But here's another picture that I took. And you see on the horizon those buildings. But I think instead of just looking from the top down, you look from the bottom up, it's a different picture. You see people playing soccer. This picture was taken from a housing occupation that, I'm not joking, is called the Gaza Strip. Because the São Paulo housing movement is obsessed with solidarity with Palestine. It's called the Gaza Strip. You see kids playing soccer, you see a community, and in the distance you see this problem. But that, I think, is the perspective we need to have. From the bottom up, this is something you can work with. This feels impossible. But this is the same situation. But here you can see there is an effort to protect and to dignify everyday life. That is the project of these social movements, and those social movements, they sometimes lose, but they sometimes win. So with that note of measured optimism, I want to end and start a conversation. Thank you very much. Sorry, I think I went very long, but I appreciate it.
Thank you, Daniel. You know, I've prepared a couple of questions for our discussion, but you've already answered them, so I'll just ask the audience. Are there any questions?
I must say I was very amazed about the part on the photovoltaic and the panels and the panel production, because it's also a very big topic here, and there are also a lot of fundings, and we have a photovoltaic strategy for the city of Vienna, and it's actually really eye-opening to see this part, and it fits so well together, because one of our big problems in the city is the supply chain. And we are not getting the panels yet, so a lot of people are waiting for the panels. And this would be extra effort to start a local production of panels. I mean, we will also not be able to get into the production so soon, but this was very eye-opening to me. So it's not really a question, but it's a thank you for this perspective more.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Just your comment on this, Daniel.
Oh, on the solar panels? Go ahead.
Well, so I've got many questions, but first of all, of course, thanks for the inspiring talk, and also for your conceptualization of how capitalism and inequality is linked to the climate crisis. I think this was very interesting also because you were explaining and describing things from the perspective of racial inequality, which is not, I would say, a very common topic or a common perspective on climate change in general. So of course this tells us that we need to probably also consider things like this in the debate that we are having in Austria. So I found this very enlightening and also inspiring what you said about the lessons that we should learn. But I was a bit, I do have a question on the concept of eco-apartheid and also the concept of climate apartheid, like how this links to capitalism, so to say. So these were so as far as I understood it, you could say that like eco-apartheid has this very long history, like a 500-year long history that connects to capitalism, but also to colonialism. And then you said this is something that's much longer than all the climate apartheid, which is something that we experience now. And the question that I'm having is whether I understood this correctly. You would say that like climate apartheid is like the stage of green capitalism that we are experiencing, or is this something like a strategy or the effect of a strategy that we now see in the development of capitalism? So this is something that I was not so that I might not have understood fully, like what the concept of eco-apartheid and climate apartheid do actually mean. I mean, I understand it from the political perspective, because that I do find very interesting, because you actually say that in order to change the problems that we are facing, we also have to change structures that are existing for a much longer time actually than the capitalist the stages of capitalist mode of production that we see in the last decades, or even this decade or the coming decades. This I found very, very interesting, but maybe you could elaborate a bit on the concepts of eco-apartheid or climate apartheid. I think you say that we need to fight not only climate apartheid, but also eco-apartheid, but what does it mean exactly?
Oh, okay, yeah. Thank you, Armin. That's a very perceptive question. So the short version is that Klima made the climate apartheid booster, and so I normally just talk about eco-apartheid. And actually sort of think we should just talk about eco-apartheid. But people say climate apartheid, so to me it's the same. And I don't, I don't have a sharp analytical difference, because I would just say climate apartheid is a reasonable word to describe the current phase of eco-apartheid. So I'm writing a book, and I had an idea which I have rejected, but the idea was to have more analytic specificity on the change of eco-apartheid before and after green capitalism. And this would basically concern the change in the way that capitalism tries to internalize externalities. And essentially the idea is that you are now internalizing externalities, but in a way that keeps reproducing inequalities. So there's an analogy in housing. There's a great Black radical housing scholar in the United States called Keeanga Yamada-Taylor. She's quite famous, and maybe you've come across her, but she has this concept of predatory inclusion. So she shows how at different periods in US history, they tried to bring Black people into the housing market, but always in ways that ends up causing more debt for them, causing more problems. So that her analysis essentially is that the liberal project of inclusion will never work, because racial capitalism is set up to be exclusive, to make profit, essentially. So I think you do have this thing where we are internalizing externalities to some degree, but then I decided ultimately that that is a very, it's a very technical way to approach the problem, so I've just thrown that out and now just focus on continuity and change. And to me, what's really important is the role of the transformation of the built environment and the role of the state, where it has a lot of analogies, I think, to post-war. But if we were having a more political economy type conversation, I would get into these different contradictions of capitalism. But they can kind of basically boil down to green capitalism is very good at investing in parts and very bad at investing in the whole. So green capitalism underinvests in changing the electric grid, and it underinvests in things like we call demand response, but essentially technologies, so that homes mainly use energy when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing, and don't rely so much on batteries. But green capitalism just wants to create, of course, more and more and more objects. So if you basically look at what any technician will tell you is the optimal change of the infrastructure to most rapidly decarbonize and use the fewest resources, that is not what green capitalism is doing. Green capitalism is going to create overproduction of just plug-in things and underproduction of what I would call enabling infrastructure. So that, we could go down this whole road, but I actually don't. The distinguishing between climate and eco-apartheid, I think, we just see what people want to talk about. The market of ideas will decide which concept is better, and then I will submit.
Well, you pointed out that the fight against climate change is a social justice issue, and could you, just explain it a little bit more? And I have also another question. It's, does this include reparations, for example, for indigenous people, for African Americans?
Thank you. That's a really great question. So 2 parts. So one, I think, it's a justice issue. I think that I know people who will never say this out loud, but I will just give what I think is the green liberal argument. The green liberal would say this: look, if we don't cut carbon emissions to a certain degree, we will have maybe 2.5, 3 degrees Celsius of warming. And then we have a danger of these tipping points. And if we have all these tipping points, then for 100,000 years or forever, humans will not be able to live well. But if we reduce carbon pollution really fast in the next 30 years, then for the next 100,000 years, we can have civilization. And so for then, if you have to sacrifice indigenous people and Black people for another 30 years, it's unfortunate. But isn't it worth it? Because the long arc of justice will bend, etc. And so, for example, people that I used to call friends would say in this latest climate bill, they say, well, you know, the good outweighs the bad. You know, the benefits outweigh the cost. And they actually, on the phone, they called up all the Black and Latino and Indigenous climate organizers and said, support this bill. It was quite violent behind the scenes. And the funders who donate money, you know, in the United States, everything is paid for by billionaires. They said, you know, support this bill. Support Biden's bill. The problem is, what is the single city that is going to suffer the most from the money they're giving to Joe Manchin for carbon capture is New Orleans. Does everybody remember Katrina? So imagine that the cost of climate progress in the United States is strengthening the oil industry in the water outside of New Orleans. It's insane, right? So I think we just have to reject that argument, and I think we should reject it morally, obviously. But I also think it's the case that from a political coalition point of view, throwing the base of progressive politics under the bus will not work. And like I was saying, once you realize that we're not actually going to all die, then I think it makes more sense to think of climate politics, like other kinds of politics, as basically either harm reduction or imposing harm. And so simply the imperative then is to cause the least amount of harm to vulnerable people as we live our economic life, right? And then there's no real separation of the climate from the economic and the social question. And therefore we should just fight for the most just possible measure. And the idea that we will sacrifice the people who have sacrificed so much for the last 500 years on a bet, really, that will pan out in a century from now. I don't have any reason to believe that that will work, actually. Like, I give you reasons why politically it's problematic. So that's that. And then briefly, reparations, yes. You know, what does reparations consist of? It's a hard question. My friend Lufumi Taiwo is a philosopher at Washington, D.C. I very strongly agree with him that the project of reparations cannot just be backward-looking compensation, but has to be forward-looking constructive politics. So what he argues, and it's identical in some ways to my argument, but it makes sense because we're friends, is that he says, look, what is happening in the next 100 years is we have to rebuild the built environment to deal with climate change. Therefore, reparations means rebuilding the built environment for the maximum benefit of Black, Indigenous, and other colonized peoples. So that's one thing. So it's not, you can have a debate and you can cut a check to people who are descendants of slavery, that's fine. But the politics get very complicated quickly. So like in California, there's a debate. If I'm Black, but my grandparents came from Jamaica, they had discrimination for 60 years. But some say, well, reparations should only be for the descendant of a literal slave. So the debates get quite complicated. And even if you maybe make a decision, probably you should also have a big emphasis on constructive investment and disproportionately in communities of color. But we also, my think tank put out a report arguing that cancellation of debt is a first step for climate reparations. It's not controversial. If you're a global south country, highly indebted, you literally cannot afford to invest in green action. The only thing you can do to earn foreign currency, which you need if you're a global south country, is to do cash crops and resource extraction. So a country like Argentina has a debt crisis. They are going to do fracking because they need American dollars. So that's actually like, again, not just from a justice point of view, but from a rational point of view. If you want to enable the global south or poor parts of the world to take climate action, you have to forgive their debts. Of course, the debt is completely unjust anyways. So yes, so I think actually the question of reparations, and of course for Indigenous peoples, and God knows for Palestinian people, and we could go on and list almost every category of people who are not living in Europe or the United States or white. But I think the question is has to move from should we have reparations to what is the most effective form of reparations. And effective means morally just and also politically exciting. So it's not like for me to decide what Black people should call reparations. We should simply work with them and figure out what we can do. And then that's a constructive conversation I think we would be excited to have. And some people oppose us, but we don't like these people anyways.
Are there any questions?
So a big question mark that popped up in my mind when you talked a lot about the coalitions that work to combat climate change, to combat or to create more social justice, is that it's from the point of view in Austria, if we decarbonize tomorrow, we are a small country, and if the US and China keep on polluting the earth, if India keeps on developing its industry, and many other countries, Brazil, and so on, keep on developing, there is very little we can do to stop climate change, especially if you look at countries like India that have been colonies and did not historically pollute the planet, but now building up its own industry will be polluting the planet a lot. Talking about coalitions, I think we have to look at coalitions on an international level, and I think this is especially difficult to talk about it from the global north, saying, if we say we shouldn't go as white people from an American perspective, we shouldn't go to marginalized groups and tell them to build a political coalition rather than, work with them, support them. But on the other hand, what should we do in the international effort to combat climate change, especially if we are dealing with political systems that don't really allow a broad organization of people who want to prevent climate change.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much for this question, because I mean there are a lot of global movements that are focusing on building transnational or international alliances. You know, for example, this famous movement of peasants, the Via Campesina. Do you know more examples? Because I think that's a very interesting point. How to resist climate change or this crisis internationally or globally?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So first of all, okay, so Austria only has 9 million people. So China is the problem. Well, what's the capital of China? Beijing. They have 20 million people. That's just 2 Austrias. So the truth is that anybody can say, we hear this all the time. So in California, they say, oh, we're just 1% of global emissions. Who cares what we do? Well, I mean, everybody is just 1%. Actually less, it's just one individual. So, you know, on the one hand, I think that math, I think we just have to throw out. And I appreciate your point, but we just have to throw it out. There is a clear, however, that being said, what California does say about itself, and Austria could say the same. California says our job is to invent models of decarbonization. And it's true, actually, in the United States, if California sets more aggressive rules for low pollution cars, half the other states just adopt them, the California rules. So, and then you could say the same in Vienna, right? If you develop social housing, now everybody comes here to look. You could develop a model of decarbonization and influence the rest of Europe. So that's fine. I think there's no problem. Everybody has to do their part. It's just the same as the argument, like, well, if I am only one person, what would I do? So then the question is, okay, well then what is an effective form of solidarity? You all know the phrase greenwashing, probably, right? In India, some climate justice activists say that what Indian elites do is poverty washing. So in India, the per capita emissions are very low, on average, because actually a huge number of people in the world, the majority of people in the world living under $2 a day live in India. So that allows the leader of India to go to the United Nations and say, well, because of colonialism, I can't use coal. Excuse me, right? We have very low emissions per capita, therefore we have a right to develop. But is that development helping most peasants in India? Absolutely not. And in fact, within India, you see all these same patterns. So in the poor neighborhoods, often occupied by Dalits, who are considered untouchables, when they need to redevelop, they just try to get rid of them. So in the United States, we call this redevelopment Negro removal, and in India, we could call it Dalit removal, right? Which is to say, you take ethno-racially discriminated against peoples and you get rid of them. Or also under Modi, who's a big green capitalist, extremely violent prejudice against Muslims. So Muslims and Dalits really bear the brunt. And then Adivasi, so there's 100 million sort of indigenous people in India. So then I think actually what you end up with, and you raise this point, the Via Campesina, it's actually just the oldest problem of internationalism that we know already. So many of these things are just a new version of the old problem. What is the difference? The working class solidarity can't just mean the Socialist Party's internationals, but how do you have global solidarity across borders? So what would it look like for Austrian progressives to combine with the farmers' protesters in India? So like you mentioned, Via Campesina, so you have agricultural farmers, agroecological farmers from around the world can do with agriculture. I think in the labor movement, we have medium success in doing this. We can think about urban social movements that could combine. So I think your question is exactly right, and then I would just send it back to you, which is like, and it's challenging because like you said, you're a movement from like white people in the north, you know, you don't want to tell people what to do, but how can you support the movement of Palestinian liberation? How can you identify indigenous movements that are fighting against mining? And how can you support them? So the world use of aluminum will quadruple. And aluminum is made out of bauxite. And bauxite is being mined in mountains in India where the indigenous peoples are resisting against the Adivasi people. So then that just simply poses from an abstract question to a concrete question. How can I find a network of solidarity with the people resisting that mining? And I think you find, even like you mentioned, Pia Campesina, but you also have pretty robust networks now of supporters in the global north, especially the United States, supporting communities resisting against mining, and often those companies are American or Canadian, actually Canadian. We could also look at the campaign against sweatshops, which is, I think, another interesting case of like translocal solidarity. So it simply is the question of like, what is a left-wing globalization from below? And I don't have all the answers, but I think when we reframe it that way, then we can at least take it on. So the question is a really excellent one. If we knew how to do internationalism from below already, we would not be in this mess. But I think we have some good efforts along the way.
Any more questions? Yeah?
Thank you. I have one question, and it concerns the thing, how can we get a more positive feeling of decarbonization? Last weekend I went to Tyrol, a rural area of Austria, and I spoke to my own friends, and we spoke about the future, and all of them had this view that they will have a house with their family, single house in the countryside, and it is quite frustrating to see that this generation, which will face climate change, privileged but still will face it, has its views of the consumption, or uses a lot of CO2, and this is their dream. So I was interested in this senator, your friend, who was, I think, Pennsylvania, is also in a rural area. How did he manage to get the votes and the people behind this, and what do you think we can do for those people who have so different views than we have to get their support for this project?
Thanks. That's a really good question. There's two parts, I think. If we think of this in terms of like urban-rural, so it's the rural lifestyle, even some of the suburban lifestyle, is not very good for the climate, right? And so let's say in Vienna, I mean, like you asked this question, like half of my Green New Deal work is inspired by Vienna. I hope my work is useful, therefore Vienna is making a contribution. So I think I think that's true, and Vienna is an incredibly low carbon city, even with the gas, because you have this dense, affordable housing, mixed income model is extraordinary climate benefit, right? So there's two elements. You decarbonize Vienna is also easy because you have district heating, so you just swap the energy, then decarbonize, easier than switching every single house, right? We have a political problem, which is that if we have only conservative politics in rural areas, it will destroy our ability to fight fascism. And I think bringing benefits of decarbonization to rural places, we have to do it. Because if the green economy is the future economy, that either will fight fascism or become led by fascists. And so then maybe there is a price to pay, and that price comes to energy efficiency. So in the US, I think at some point we give up, we say, people in rural areas, we do not tell them you need to ride the bus. But then we will lose. We will simply say, you can decarbonize rural transportation with electric vehicles and electric trucks, even though the Ford F-150 is a disgusting monster. And you can decarbonize rural housing, you use heat pumps, right? And you can decarbonize building materials, we know how. But it's more expensive and it's less efficient, and we do use resources maybe that could be better used somewhere else. But I think in the short term, and sometimes we even have to change our language. So in the bill that I mentioned, the home repair bill, it never has the word green or climate. And Nikhil called me, he was like, Daniel, I want you to talk about my bill on Twitter, because I have people on Twitter. And I said, but then people will be mad at you. He's like, that's a good point. Wait till I pass the bill before you talk about the Green New Deal. But he actually had activists from the Sunrise Movement come with him, but when he went to rural areas, he was like, and it was okay. So I think, be careful about language, but I think the point you raise is correct. At the end of the day, there is some choice to be made, like what modifications do we make to our program. But I think from a political strategy point of view, if the progressives become isolated in cities, well, we know what happened in Austria 100 years ago, and we can see it in the United States what's happening now. So my view is that actually strategically, the two things we have to do at once, which is very hard, conservative US rural, often, not only, but often white populations, and then the multiracial working class. We have to link those together. It's also hard because we want to build clean energy in rural places, and often the people there don't like it, so we have to find a way to build that they will appreciate. So I wouldn't say that I have an answer to your question, but I think you named a really important question. But we cannot give up on rural spaces, I think, at all, because the political danger that poses is extreme. The danger that it would destroy all the other progress that we have to make. A lot of very smart people in Vienna. So I'm very impressed.
You get to help me with my master thesis now, Daniel. I have a question concerning the role of the state in this, because on the one hand, of course, we rely on the state for all the projects that we want, public housing, climate transformation for state funds, all of this. And at the same time, I found interesting that you mentioned that even conservatives, Republicans now demand of the states to come in with funds to fund this project of green capitalism. I think it may even be probably argued that these functions that you said green capitalism also has of perpetuating the division of the labor force is also in the capitalist state a function that the state can fulfill. So what would you say, what does it depend on, whether the state influences these things in one or the other direction?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think green capitalism is like a bad boyfriend. They want all the support and they want to get nothing in return, right, from their partner, which is the state. There are specifics. I think there are dimensions that are specific to the renewable energy economy and infrastructure we could talk about, but I think it's also kind of a classic dilemma. And green capital needs the state for financial support, for administrative support, etc. And the term often used now is de-risking, which is amazing because what they told us is that Adam Smith told us the capitalist likes to take risks, or creative destruction, right? Capitalists love risks, they live for competition. And when they criticize anything in the social welfare policy, they say that's anti-competitive. But the number one goal of every business is to eliminate competition. And so what the World Bank and the OECD want to do now is they want to de-risk green investment. It's amazing, even the word, it's like, no risk. So the state says, we'll take all the risk, all the costs, and you will only have benefits for a business. Lion, the entrepreneur, is the bad boyfriend. But the reliance on the state creates opening for democratic politics. It means that the enabler of green capital is subject to democratic politics. And I think that is a good way to think about the welfare state as well, right? Post-war capitalism. I mean, if you don't rely on the state, then you can get away with more. And so I think that's how we probably have to think about the rise of social democracy in Europe after World War II. You depend on the state to rebuild the economy after the war, to some degree in the United States as well. Actually, the war mobilizations often had quite strong welfare policies. They built housing for women workers in the United States during World War II. They did all kinds of things. And actually, they did in the United Kingdom, the highest increase in life expectancy came during the wars because of rationing. So the working class never ate so well, except during the wars, because they had to give everybody a reasonable amount of food. So to me, like literally, if you're a working class person in England, your life got longer, the most during World War I and during World War II, thanks to rationing, because you need that public support. So I think that's the opening for us. And then it's a question of what kind of mixed economy will we have over the next while. I think some of my friends on the left want to say we get rid of capitalism, get rid of growth, and only have perfect green socialism, and I hope so too. But I think in the short term, it's a contest over what role will the state play, just exactly like you said, and that's just up for grabs. Maybe I'll just say one more funny thing. Emmanuel Wallerstein, have you heard of him? He's a great Marxist, and he has this joke. He says, by the 1970s, the left basically went everywhere. They're communist or anti-colonial or social democrats. Almost everywhere in the world by the 1970s, one of these left-wing formations had won. And he said every left-wing formation had only two parts of the program: seize the state, change the state. Everyone succeeded at one and everyone failed at two. So we can acknowledge that it's tough.
So thank you so much, Daniel. We have to leave this building at 9 o'clock. So at this point, I'd like to ask you for a brief closing statement. Is that all right?
Yeah, I think extremely grateful to be here. The biggest honor in the world is to be in a building that has been educating workers and people for more than a century. It seems everything good here has been happening for a century. It's crazy. But I think there's some deep things that are important too. Yeah, it's an extreme honor to be here. And I think this is the fight over the character of the green economy and the climate crisis was one of the defining fights of our lives. And it is depressing to think about the ways we could lose, but the ways we could win are very exciting. And so I think there is no better way to live than to be in this fight. So I hope that we will all be in it, and in 50 years we'll all be drinking whiskey and telling stories about what it was like in the early days.
Thank you, Daniel and Anna Cohen.
Low carbon whiskey. Thank you so much.